We are getting some breaking news in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie.
Before anything else, subscribe right now, because in this video we are answering the one question that has haunted.
There are some cases that do not begin with noise. They begin with silence. A phone that stops ringing. A house that suddenly feels too still. A family member who does not answer. A routine that breaks without warning. And when that silence belongs to a woman like Nancy Guthrie, a woman described by those around her as steady, loving, and deeply connected to her family, the absence does not feel ordinary. It feels wrong from the very first moment. At first, the questions were simple. Where was Nancy? Had she left on her own? Had there been a medical emergency? Was there some innocent explanation hidden inside the confusion? But as hours became days and days stretched into weeks, investigators began to see something darker forming beneath the surface. This was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about timing. It was about access. It was about family. And it was about the kind of trust that can be turned into a weapon when the wrong person gets close enough. In the beginning, the public saw only fragments. A missing person report. Concern from loved ones. A community searching for answers. A family asking for help. But behind the scenes, investigators were looking at something far more complicated. They were not only asking where Nancy went. They were asking who had the opportunity to know her routine, who knew her habits, who knew when she was vulnerable, and who could move around her life without raising suspicion. Because in a case like this, the most dangerous person is not always the stranger outside the window. Sometimes, it is someone who already has a key. Someone who has sat at the table. Someone who has smiled for family photos. Someone who knows where the cameras are, where the medications are kept, and what time the lights usually go out. That is what made this investigation so chilling. The possibility that Nancy's disappearance was not random, not sudden, not a moment of confusion, but something planned slowly, quietly, and carefully by someone who understood her life from the inside. As investigators began building the early timeline, one detail kept returning to the center. Nancy's final known hours. Those hours mattered because they were not empty. They were filled with normal things. Family contact, conversation, familiar surroundings. The ordinary rhythm of an evening that should have ended with safety. And that is what makes stories like this so hard to process. Because evil rarely announces itself. It does not always enter with violence at the front door. Sometimes it hides behind calm behavior. Behind polite words. Behind someone pretending to be worried while secretly knowing more than they are willing to say. In those first stages, investigators were careful. They could not accuse without evidence. They could not jump ahead of the facts. They had to move piece by piece, separating emotion from proof. But even then, something did not sit right. Certain answers sounded too smooth. Certain timelines felt too rehearsed. Certain details appeared before they should have. And certain people seemed less surprised than they should have been. When detectives and federal agents examine a disappearance, they do not only listen to what someone says. They listen to how the story changes. They watch the pauses. They study what is remembered too clearly. They notice what is left out. They compare every statement against phone records, cameras, movement, money, and digital activity. Because a person can control their face. They can control their voice. They can act worried. They can act heartbroken. They can act offended that anyone would even question them. But they cannot always control the trail they leave behind. And in Nancy's case, that trail would become one of the most important parts of the investigation. Investigators reportedly began looking deeper into digital records. Phones. Messages. Online searches, device activity, surveillance cameras, financial movement, anything that could help rebuild the truth of those missing hours. And slowly a picture began forming. Not a complete picture at first, more like shadows on a wall. A possible route, a possible motive, a possible connection, a possible person who may have known far more than they admitted. The public may have been waiting for one dramatic breakthrough, but investigations rarely work that way. Most cases are not solved by one shocking discovery. They are solved by pressure. A small inconsistency here. A recovered message there. A camera angle from a neighbor's home. A cash withdrawal that does not make sense. A phone ping that places someone where they claim they were not. Each piece on its own may not be enough. But together they begin to speak. And when investigators looked at the people closest to Nancy, one direction reportedly became harder and harder to ignore. The son-in-law. A man who, on the outside, had every reason to appear connected to the family. Someone who could present himself as concerned. Someone who could speak about Nancy with emotion. Someone who could say the right things at the right time. But the closer investigators looked, the more the polished version of events began to crack. At first he seemed calm. Too calm, some might say. In interviews, people often expect anger, tears, confusion, fear. But experienced investigators know there is no single correct reaction to trauma. People process shock differently. So they do not judge one emotion. They look for patterns. And the pattern here, according to the direction of the investigation, appeared troubling. The story was neat. The memory was clean. The timeline was polished. The concern sounded controlled. He reportedly described Nancy's last evening in a way that made everything feel normal. A quiet time. A family connection. A final goodbye that sounded almost gentle. But investigators were not satisfied with gentle. They needed verifiable. Because when someone disappears, a beautiful story is not proof. A calm voice is not proof. A sad expression is not proof. A family connection is not proof. There are some cases that do not begin with noise. Into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. The case had already changed shape. A house that in the beginning it looked like a missing person investigation. A family member who does not answer. A woman gone. A routine that breaks without warning. A community searching. And when that silence belongs to a woman like Nancy Guthrie, but as the days passed, the questions became heavier. Steady, loving, the search was no longer only to her family. Nancy was. The absence does not feel ordinary. It became about who had access to her life. It feels wrong from the very first moment. Who understood her routine at first, and who may have known exactly when she would be most vulnerable. Had she left on her own? That is the part of the case that had there been a medical emergency? Because when investigators begin looking at strangers, the fear is outside the home. But as hours became days, when investigators began looking inside the family investigators began to see something dark performing beneath the surface. It reaches into the dining room. This was no longer just about a missing woman. It was about family gatherings. It was about moments that once felt safe. It was about family. And in Nancy's case, it was about the kind of trust that can be turned into a weapon when the wrong person gets close to the family. In the beginning, the public saw only fragments. He had not entered the investigation as an obvious from loved ones. He had entered as someone connected to Nancy, a family who could speak about her. But behind someone who could claim investigators were looking at someone who could say he loved her, respected her, they were not only asking answers like everyone else. They were asking investigators who were trained to know her appearances, who knew her habits, who knew when she was vulnerable, they do not stop who could move around her life without raising suspicion. Family titles. Because in a case like this, one question the most dangerous person is not always the stranger outside the window. And slowly, sometimes, according to the direction of the original case narrative, someone who began to face pressure from details that were harder to family photos. At first, someone who knows where the cameras are, where the medications are kept, normal family and what time the lights usually go out. A peaceful evening. That is what made this investigation so chilling. A woman the possibility that Nancy's disappearance was not random. It was the kind of account that could make him appear not caring and confusion. The kind of account that placed Nancy's final known hours carefully by someone who understood her life from the inside. But investigators know that sometimes began building the early timeline. One detail kept returning to automatically. Nancy's final known hours. A person who is telling the truth may forget because they were not empty. They may become emotional things. They may jump around. They may correct themselves. Familiar surroundings. But the ordinary rhythm of the story that should have ended with safety. And that is what makes stories like this so hard to process. The memories arrive rarely announces itself. The emotions it does not always enter with violence. The concern sounds controlled. Sometimes it hides. And when that happens, investigators do not accuse immediately. Behind someone pretending to be worried, they allow the story to settle more than they are willing to say. Because once a person locks themselves into investigators were careful. The evidence can begin testing every word. They could not jump ahead of the next phase of the investigation. They had to move piece by piece, separating emotion moved away from what he said. But even then, something did not sit right. Phone records, certain answers sounded too smooth. Surveillance timelines felt too rehearsed. Messages, certain details appeared before they should have. Timing, and certain people seemed less surprised than they should have been. When detectives and federal agents examine a disappearance, but as more of them turn on to what the shape of the truth begins to listen to how the story changes. And for investigators, one of the strongest tools in a modern case is digital evidence. They notice what is left out. They can delete things. They compare every statement against disappears when it is removed from the screen. Money and digital activity. They believe a search history is gone when the browser can control their face. They believe a phone can be turned off and forgotten. They can act worried. But digital evidence does not always vanish that easily. They can act offended that anyone would even question metadata. But they cannot always control the trail they leave behind. Cell tower connections. And in Nancy's case, recovered trail would become one of the most important parts of the investigation. Sometimes, the very investigators reportedly began looking deeper into digital records. Because innocent behavior usually does not require cleanup. Online searches. That does not mean every deleted message is surveillance cameras. People delete things for many reasons. Anything that could help an investigation timing missing hours. What was slowly a picture began forming. Not a complete picture before and after. More like shadows on a wall. Connected to the disappearance route. Did it happen before police asked questions? A possible connection. Those are the kinds of details investigators study more than they admitted. In
The
Nancy's
public
case,
may have been
the
waiting
original
for more
narrative
dramatic
suggests that
breakthrough,
digital
but
behavior
investigations
became a major
rarely work
focus.
that way.
The
Most
possibilities
cases
of
are
hidden
not solved by
communications,
one shocking
unusual
discovery.
phone activity,
They are solved
and
by
messages
pressure.
connected to
A
timing
small
and movement
inconsistency
created a
here,
deeper concern.
a recovered message
And that concern
there.
centered
A
on
camera
planning.
angle from a neighbor's
Planning is
home.
what separates
A
a
cash
moment of
withdrawal
panic
that
from
does not
something
make
far
sense.
colder.
A phone
Planning
ping
means there
places
was
someone
time to
where they
think,
claimed they were
time
not.
to prepare.
Each piece
Time
on
to
its own may
decide.
not be enough.
Time to turn back.
But together they begin
And if
to
someone
speak.
had studied
And
Nancy's
when
habits
investigators
before she
looked at the people
disappeared,
closest to
then the
Nancy,
case becomes more
one
than a
direction
family
reportedly
tragedy.
became harder
It becomes
and
an
harder
act
to
of
ignore.
betrayal built in
The
advance.
son-in-law.
Investigators
on the
reportedly
outside
looked at
had
whether
every
Nancy's
reason to
routine
appear
had
had
been
been
observed
observed
closely.
Someone
Her
who
home,
could present
her
himself as
schedule,
concerned.
her medication,
Someone who could speak
her
about
evenings,
Nancy with
her
emotion.
doors,
Someone
her
who could say
patterns.
the right things
That
at the
is the
right
kind
time.
of knowledge
But
only
the
certain
closer
people would
investigators
have.
looked,
A stranger
the more
might
the
not
polished
know when
version
Nancy
of events
usually
began
settled
to
in
crack.
for the night. At
A
first she
stranger
seemed
might
calm,
not know whether
too
she
calm
took
some might say.
medication.
In
A
interviews,
stranger might
people
not
often
know which
expect
entrance
anger,
was easiest,
tears,
which camera mattered,
confusion,
or which part
fear.
of the house was
But
most
experienced
private.
investigators
someone
know there
close
is
could
no
know.
single correct
Someone
reaction
trusted
to
could
trauma.
know.
And
People
that is what
process
makes the
shock
story
differently.
feel so disturbing.
So they do not judge
because
one emotion.
closeness should protect
They look
the
for
person.
patterns.
Here,
And the pattern
investigators
here, according
appeared
to
to be
the direction
asking
whether
whether
the closeness
investigation
had been used
appeared
against her.
troubling. As the
story
digital
was
trail
neat.
grew,
The
another
memory
layer
was
came
clean.
into view. The
Money
timeline was polished.
Money does not
The
prove
concern
guilt on its
sounded
own.
controlled.
Financial stress
He
alone does
reportedly
not make
described
someone
Nancy's
capable
last
of hurting
evening
in
in
a
a
way
way
that made everything
Many
feel
people
normal.
face debt,
A quiet
foreclosure,
time,
unpaid
family
bills,
connection,
and fear without
a
ever
final
crossing
goodbye
a moral
that sounded
line.
almost gentle.
But investigators look at motive
because
because motive
motive
helps
helps
explain
explain
why
why
someone might
they
take a
need it
risk.
verifiable.
And the financial
Because when
picture
someone
surrounding
disappears,
the son-in-law,
a beautiful
as presented
story
in
is
the
not
source
proof.
narrative,
A
was
calm
troubling.
voice is not proof.
Death,
A
pressure,
sad expression is
possible
not proof.
foreclosure,
A family
cash
connection
movement
is not
that needed
proof.
explanation.
A life that may have looked stable from the outside while breaking apart behind closed doors. That is often how financial desperation hides. People still smile. They still attend dinners. They still answer the phone.
There
By
are
the
some
time
cases that
every
do not
investigation
begin with
with
noise.
evidence
They
stops
begin
with
with
Guthrie,
silence.
it begins
The
to
case
form
that
that already
clearly
changed
changed
shape.
not all
A
at
house
once.
that
In the
suddenly
beginning,
feels
not
too
with
still.
one
Missing
dramatic
person
a family member
investigation.
who does
Not
not
with
answer.
one
Perfect
perfect
video
video
routine
or
that
one
brings
single
without
document
warning.
that answers
Community
every
and when that
searching.
silence
But
belongs
home
to a
suddenly
woman like
quiet.
Nancy Guthrie,
But as the
one
days
time
went
passed,
described
by
by
those
those
around
her
her
heavier,
steady,
one
loving,
financial
and
no
deeply
longer
connected to
only
her
found
family.
contradictions.
The absence does
And
not
then
begin
someone
with
out who had
the story
access
that
to
feels
her
wrong
life
from the
who
very
understood
beginning.
her root shape
At first,
and who
in
knew
Nancy
known
Guthrie's
exactly
case
when
that
she
she
was
was
most
Nancy.
vulnerable.
Had she
Because
left
the
on her
closer
own, the
investigators
case had
looked,
there been a medical
the more
emergency,
this case appeared to
because
move
when
away
their
from the easy
explanation
explanation
strangers
inside the
and
confusion
something far
outside
more
but as
personal.
hours became
But
days,
when
something
investigators
stretched
begin
into
to
looking
look
inside the family
investigators
something that
began
may
to
have
see
started
something
long
dark
before
before
anyone
anyone
realized
reaches
Nancy
into
was
the
in
danger.
This was no longer
By
just
this
about
stage,
conversation.
investigators were
It was
no
about
longer
gatherings.
only asking
It was
what
about
happened
moments
that
that once felt
they were
about
asking
family.
what
And
happened
in Nancy
before
was
that
about
case.
the kind
That
of
is
truth
why
watching
watching
Nancy
into
into
a
a
weapon when the
the
wrong
man who
person
had
gets
once
close
stood
enough,
close
who
to the
knew when
family
she was
was
now
now
under
the
a
public
different
saw her
kind of
health
attack.
habits.
He
Who
had
would
not
not enter the
interlayed over
investigation
home,
as an
concerned
obvious
who had a
loved
reason
ones.
to benefit
He
if
had
she was
community
gone.
searching for
Those
answers.
questions are
A
disturbing
family
because
as
they
they
point
speak
to
about
knowledge
her.
only
But
someone
behind the
who
scenes,
could claim concern.
investigators
And that
were
is the
looking
dark
someone who
center
could
of
say
more
he loved her.
complicated.
Nancy's
They were
life
not
may
only
not have
asking
answers
like
like
everyone
everyone
else.
else. They were
It may
asking
have
who
been
had
studies
enough
from
training
within
to know her
past
routines.
the original
Who knew
source
her
script
habits.
do not
They
stop
knew when she was
investigation
vulnerable.
as they do not
Focusing
stop
heavily
the
on
move
her
around
life
her
digital
life
without
they do not
raising
stop
suspicion.
family pressure.
Because in a case
Surveillance
like this,
one question
impossible
again and
plans
again
by
person
someone
is
not
not
always
always
stranger
stranger
outside
evidence.
the window.
A responsible
Slowly,
documentary version
someone who already has
details
case
carefully.
Someone
Is
who has
investigative
to claims
pressure
or alleged
from
someone who
details
has
that
smiled
harder
from
to find
financial
photos.
records.
At first,
Someone
the
who
version
knows
when
when
handled
cameras are
carefully,
the emotional
medications
waves
were
are
kept
normal
and what time the
life
woman was
usually
a
go
peaceful
out.
evening.
That is what made this
conversation.
investigation. And investigators were now trying to determine whether Nancy's disappearance was on the outside the kind of account that could make him appear not a moment of innocence.
At this
stage,
planned
son-in-law's
Nancy's
quiet
story
had
had
carefully by someone who understood her life. He had described but investigators know that sometimes building the final interaction. One detail kept returning automatically made him appear like Nancy's well-known hours. A person who is telling hours beginning to challenge that veracity. And they may become challenges a story they may jump holds. They may correct themselves to break. Familiar investigators report ordinary rhythm of communication that should have around the time Nancy disappeared. And that is what makes stories like this so hard to smoothly. Device activity. The memories arrive too possible hidden context. The emotions appear in the right coordination with violence. In a modern case, control sometimes it hides when that happens. Investigators do not feel behind polite words. They do not protect behind someone pretending to be. They do not allow the story to say more than they are willing to say. Because once a person locks the call, investigators were careful. A message was sent or was testing every word. Phone connected. That is why we had the next phase of the investigation. So it stayed still, separating emotion from what he said. But even then, also be honest, not sit right. And for investigators, financial honesty matters more than certain timelines felt because emotion can be performed. Certain details concern can be performed. Timing and certain people seem less surprised than they should have formed.
When
Even
detectives
those
and
lights
federal
may not
agents
show the
examine
full timestamps,
but as they do not only digital records digital records
truth begins
they listen to
surveillance cameras
for investigators.
Watch
One of the strongest tools they study what is remembered digital a person speaks with
they notice
people
what is
believe
left
they can
out. That is
believe
why the
they
case
compare
began
every
tightly
statement
against
against
every
every
piece of evidence being compared to the human digital activity, and the human story person can control their face. They believe they can control one of the most important questions investigators have to answer not always vanish. They can act offended. Planning is the difference between chaos and calculation. But they cannot always control the search for information connected to Nancy's case. Disable cameras become one of the most important understanding Nancy's sometimes the very investigators would not become random curiosity digital because innocent behavior usually does not require online searches. That does not mean Nancy may have had time surveillance before she ever financial news for many reasons. Anything that can help investigation timing is already forming. What was delayed? Someone may have smiled for dinner while thinking about contacted before. Someone may have listened to shadows on a watch connected to the disappearance and stored away the possible motive. Police that is not just criminal behavior. Those are the kinds that is emotional investigators far more than because Nancy was not a stranger to the original narrative that digital but investigation was someone who had opened the door. The possibilities are not solved by one unusual phone activity. And if that close message is connected to timing, then the crime becomes more than a disappearance. Recovered message becomes a betrayal. Camera angle family planning is what separates a moment as investigators continue to build the case. Planning the financial side where they claim they were not to prepare. Money does not on its own may not be enough. Time to turn but together they begin to someone studied and when investigators can reveal more closest to the original narrative one direction which tragedy financial becomes an act of betrayal built in his son-in-law. Cash withdrawals. Investigators on the possibility that every Nancy to appear connected to become part of the investigation. Someone who could present himself as those details must be someone who could allege Nancy with emotion, but they create the motive saying the right things. That is the kind of knowledge when the closer investigator. The question was not stranger whether someone needed Nancy usually said many people need money. At first, the stranger might whether someone who came desperation or greed. A stranger might see Nancy as the answer to their problem. Which camera matters? That is a hard idea. Part of the house was but experienced investigators know there's no single someone trusted trusted family. That is what makes the story reduced in someone's mind. They do not judge one emotion. They look for financial solution. Here, the pattern is investigators to the direction whether closeness should be changes trouble legal as the digital trail grew. Another timing would have carried serious. The timeline was polished. Money because if someone concerned sound your money and suddenly financial stress alone does not make someone capable of hurting in a way that makes everything dangerous when it meets desperation. Closure, unpaid connection, fear without ever considering that sound almost gentle. But investigators cannot motive helps explain why someone might take need to rely on and the financial because when someone disappears, son-in-law motive helps explain why the narrative matters. A calm voice why the messages matter. Pressure why the search is not foreclosure. Why the family cash movement that needed why the money matters. A life that may have looked stable from the outside because a crime is not only about what closed doors. It is also about why someone chose to make it hides. By this point, the interview room had become a battleground, not between loud voices but between two versions of reality. On one side was the suspect's version. He was concerned. He was innocent. He loved Nancy. He had no reason to harm her. He was just another family member waiting for answers. On the other side was the evidence.